to the full what innocent British police officials and others are facing in Palestine. Murders such as these are now threatened against various people in Britain as well.
In Palestine, outrage follows outrage. One of the latest was the derailing of a stationary goods train on an embankment outside Tel Aviv. A long wire lead connected the explosive charge with the firing mechanism, which was operated by the terrorists in a nearby orange grove very early in the morning. Much damage was done, and until the repair work was completed, and that, as you see, with some difficulty, the main Egypt line was blocked. This, of course, is only one example of the numerous blow-ups of trains and road vehicles which have been adding to the already tragic list of British casualties in recent weeks. Smoke rising from a street in Jerusalem indicates yet another vain attempt by the Jewish terrorist gang to intimidate authority. A mine filled with TNT had been placed in the Inland Revenue building. It was discovered and exploded by fire from an armoured car. The two-story building was completely destroyed. The Jewish constable on duty, who was beaten up by the terrorists and injured by the explosion, died later, and a number of servicemen and civilians were injured. Income tax papers littered the ruins, and windows were smashed in many nearby buildings and shops. A British lieutenant was one of the seriously wounded in this murderous outrage, which, like all the rest, continue to shock and anger the people of Britain, not to mention our men who have to bear the brunt in Palestine.
The Neseth Israel, a 3,500-ton vessel, brought nearly 4,000 illegal immigrants to Haifa, the largest shipload yet. When she docked, violent resistance broke out against troops ordered to transfer the Jewish refugees to a ship, presumably bound for Cyprus. Fire hoses and tear gas were used in a battle lasting half an hour, during which a number of the refugees jumped overboard, apparently intending to swim ashore. Movie Turn's cameramen, together with many press representatives, were not permitted to witness the battle. They were kept a long way off behind barbed wire barriers until all was over. The official reason given was that it's dangerous and you might get your cameras damaged. Finally, when order had been restored after casualties had occurred on both sides, the transfer was carried out. In spite of great provocation, not only in the form of placards threatening reprisals, but also in the form of direct action, British troops are reported to have acted with great restraint. Their task is to carry out orders, in the circumstances an unpleasant and often dangerous job. What is needed more than ever is a high-level solution to the apparently insoluble problem of Palestine. Field Marshal Lord Montgomery of Alamein.
From Haifa come pictures showing the result of the recent outrage that shattered the brief lull in terrorist activity. The incident was caused by a man, believed by some to be one of the Stern gang this time, driving a stolen van full of explosives to quarters where it blew up. 2 British and 2 Arab policemen were killed, and others are reported missing. More than 60 police, soldiers and civilians were injured. Many of the casualties were caused by flying glass, and a great deal of damage was done, not only at police headquarters, but also in the neighborhood. Windows were broken as far as a mile away. Troops, as well as police, were immediately engaged in a wide and very thorough search for suspects. All who might have had a hand in this, the worst outrage since that at the King David Hotel, were rounded up. People were brought in for screening from all over the place and kept inside a barbed wire cage to await interrogation. The attack was evidently in open defiance of the widespread condemnation of terrorism on the eve of the London conference. Mr. Ben-Gurion's house in Tel Aviv was the scene of the recent meeting of the Jewish Agency Executive. Among the leaders of official Zionism, Mr. Shapiro holds the title of Immigration Minister. Mr. Kaplan, Treasury, without a hat, enters with Mr. Eisenberg and Mr. Kolodny. Mr. Rames is head of Vard Leumi. Mr. Bernstein, Trade and Industry. Dr. Moshe Snee, formerly chief of the Haganah, and Mrs. Golda Meyerson, head of the Political Bureau. Mr. Ben-Gurion, chairman of the executive, leads them into his study for the meeting. Although condemning terrorism, the executive decided not to participate in any government or army campaign against the terrorists. Soon afterwards, Ben-Gurion left for London for talks with the colonial secretary. This is the house from which Major Collins was recently kidnapped in Jerusalem. Abductions, indeed, have been the latest form of terrorist activity in Palestine, Judge Wyndham having been seized while actually in his courtroom at about the same time. The search for Major Collins, for his assailants, or for any clue was immediate and thorough. In addition, General Cunningham, the High Commissioner, threatened complete military control for certain areas unless the kidnapped men were released within 48 hours. In the meantime, the widespread comb-out continued. When Major Collins was eventually found, he was seriously injured and had suffered much ill treatment. On the other hand, when the judge returned to his home, he said that he had been released after good treatment during his detention. Since these incidents, strict measures to prevent further kidnappings are reported to have been taken. When Major Collins was kidnapped in Jerusalem, he suffered much ill treatment at the hands of terrorists, particularly from chloroform burns. Here he's seen recovering from his injuries in the government hospital. It was soon afterwards that special security measures were adopted in Palestine. Barbed wire barricades increased in number. Here in Jerusalem, residential quarters that may be taken over for government officials are wired off. Identity checkups were multiplied, though at this time curfew had not been imposed, and troops were kept busy on many roads. But the biggest news was the evacuation order for British non-essential civilians. Children were soon to be seen leaving school and going home to pack up. Obviously, the authorities meant business, and the presence of women and children in particular hampered the troops' activity. From Palestine, a Movietone cameraman sends more scenes of Operation Polly, the evacuation of non-essential civilians from Jerusalem and other dangerous areas. Some were off to Britain, but a large number were bound for camps in Egypt, hoping, as we all hope, that the apparently insoluble problem of Palestine may soon be solved. Following this evacuation, intense military activity was to be seen in the streets of Jerusalem. Vast enclosures in the city were wired off as security zones, chiefly for government officials. The place, in fact, was rapidly becoming a sort of fortress or series of fortresses, and there was every indication that the authorities, the army and police, were anticipating trouble on a big scale and were determined to be absolutely ready to meet it. Operation Polly had certainly helped to clear the way for all these preventive measures, and now they were being carried out with all the thoroughness demanded by the situation. Whatever policy might finally be adopted for the future of Palestine, Britain was clearly resolved to deal very firmly with the terrorists should they attempt to fulfill their latest threats of violence. This is the British Officers' Club, the Goldsmiths' Club, in King George V Avenue, Jerusalem, scene of one of the latest outrages by Jewish terrorists. And here's the scene after the blow-up, which was carried out under cover of machine gun fire, the terrorists driving up and throwing explosives into the building. As the Jewish Agency building was opposite, the area had not been completely wired off, a fact which made the attack easier. Many arrests followed the incident, in which nearly a score of people lost their lives, a number of the killed and wounded, as always, being British. This is only one of many outrages perpetrated in the fresh outbreak of terrorist activity, openly described as war, and as a result, the British authorities have imposed martial law in certain areas of Palestine. Streets are empty, people are confined to their houses, civil government is withdrawn. The situation in Palestine, pending its reference to UNO, could scarcely be worse. News from Palestine includes these scenes of the oil fire at Haifa. After a number of explosions caused by terrorists, fire broke out in the oil zone, where a number of storage tanks blazed up and continued to burn furiously for days. At least 10 out of the 17 tanks, with capacities varying from 1,000 to 4,000 tons, were involved. The efforts of the firefighters were mainly directed towards confining the outbreak to one area, but in any case, as our pictures clearly show, loss and damage were bound to be on a vast scale. Rough estimates already put the cost at over £250,000. And this... Before a committee of the United Nations Assembly, the British intention of relinquishing the Palestine mandate was stated by the Colonial Secretary, Mr. Creech Jones, who added,
I repeat again that His Majesty's government have determined to base their policy on the assumption that they must lay down the mandate, under which they have sought for 25 years to discharge their obligations to fulfill the growth of the Jewish national home and to protect the interests of the Arab population. In order that there may be no misunderstanding of the attitude and policy of Britain, I have been instructed by His Majesty's government to announce with all solemnity that they have consequently decided that in the absence of a settlement, they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
The recent outrage by Palestine terrorists, the one-ton bomb... Before a United Nations General Assembly Committee, America's Palestine policy was recently defined by Mr. Herschel Johnson.
The United States delegation supports the basic principles of the unanimous recommendations and the majority plan which provides for partition and immigration. The United States government is willing to participate in a United Nations program to assist the parties involved in the establishment of a workable political settlement in Palestine. We refer to assistance through the United Nations in meeting economic and financial problems and the problem of internal law and order during the transition period. The latter problem might require the establishment of a special constabulary or police force recruited on a volunteer basis by the United Nations.
It was shortly after that declaration that the American consulate in Jerusalem was the target for a bomb. 2 women were injured by glass. Here's one being taken to hospital. Comparatively minor damage was done by this attack, which was the third of its kind in a fortnight, the Swedish and Polish consulates also having been attacked. A minute search for fragments of the bomb was carried out, as these might provide a clue to the identity of the assailants.